Good morning, students. This lecture is for Monday, March the 23rd, or Tuesday, March the 24th, depending on which U.S. history class you're in. This is going to become our new norm for a while. I apologize for this. I know this is not your fault, and I hate that we're having to do a format like this, but we will work with you in any way we can to help you succeed in having a good semester yet to come. As we were discussing last time, we were talking about the end of World War One. Want to back up for one of the classes, but for the other class, this will be new material for you. But these are a couple of lists that I believe are very, very important for you to know. So the first list is out of Wilson's 14 points that we discussed earlier. What he wanted, number one, was open conduct of diplomacy. This had been done in secret, and all the diplomacy that had taken place in secret, of course, had helped lead to World War One. Secondly, he wanted the recognition of neutral nations' rights to continue maritime commerce. Obviously, that would have been an important thing for the United States because we continued to try to trade before we actually entered the war. Number three was removal of international trade barriers. Again, this was something that would have affected the United States. Number four, and this will be somewhat attempted, the reduction of armaments. Some nations are going to have this imposed upon them, others will volunteer. Japan, quite honestly, will ignore this one. And then number five, the transformation of colonial empires. This did happen, even though it may not have been desired and wanted, but Austria, Hungary will split apart, the Ottoman Turk Empire, the Russian Empire, a lot of these are going to be destroyed. And then, of course, point 13, just to throw that one in, would be a creation of a new nation for the Polish people. Of course, Poland had vanished from the map twice, and hopefully this would establish them as a sovereign nation. And then the 14th point was for the League of Nations to preserve global peace. All right, so what did Europe look like after? What did World War I really leave as a legacy in Europe? Number one, it was much poorer. Of course, the war had cost every nation tremendously. France, Belgium were very much destroyed as a result of the war. There had been some, but limited damage in Germany. But the European nations were much, much poorer. Number two, they were more violent. Shortages, lack of homes, people wandering around from place to place. This often does, and did in this case, leave people being much, much more violent. Number three, people were more polarized. Nationalism had become even stronger, and as a result of it becoming even stronger, France was France, Germany was Germany, and there was not going to be a whole lot of compromise going on between folks. Number four, people were more cynical. This one is very important because what happens with World War I is Europe's idea of progress, continual progress, is shattered. It doesn't exist anymore. And so people are cynical. Where are answers? What do we do? And this is going to hurt Europe for a while to come. Number 5, it was less sure of itself. Oh, Europe had been full of itself for many, many years after the Renaissance had begun, but now, no. And then finally, number 6, it was less capable of decisive action. So, for good or ill, the United States is going to emerge as a world power. And so, as far as the U.S. is concerned, if you consider this a plus, that's exactly what it is. Some people would not have. But the U.S. will no longer be an isolationist nation. We will no longer stick our head in the sand and not participate in what goes on. So what happened? As we said, President Wilson had some very moral principles that, had they been listened to, it probably would have made a huge, huge difference. But he was clumsy in the presentation of them, and the prime ministers of Britain, France, and Italy wanted vengeance. They wanted to punish the Germans in every way they possibly could. And so the harsh provisions, and I've given you the 4 clauses of the Versailles Treaty, the harsh conditions were hopefully to weaken Germany so that it would never rise again. So Wilson was not listened to. We do have some new independent countries, and I find this quite interesting. Austria becomes a nation in and of itself. Hungary does the same. Poland reappears. Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia in Central Europe. We have 4 new nations along the Baltic Sea. Finland, Finland just comes into existence as an independent state right after World War I. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. The German colonies and the Turkish colonies in Africa and the Middle East go to France and Great Britain. So, you see who the winners were. And though the United States is the primary power in the world now, the real winners were Britain and France with what they came out with. So, Wilson comes home. And the U.S. Senate does not actually want to approve the peace treaty. United States doesn't approve the League of Nations because isolationists are still very, very powerful in Congress, and they decide that Wilson's commitment to the League was a threat to America's independence. And they didn't like the idea of continuous involvement in world affairs, quite honestly. So we have a summer of debate, and literally Wilson does the one thing he thinks he has to do to get this approved. He hits the rails and goes across the nation in a tour trying to sell the American people. But sadly for him, Wilson will have a crushing stroke. It almost killed him, but it made him a little more arrogant and stubborn. He became emotionally irrational. And quite honestly, for the last 17 months of his term, his wife, along with his aides and trusted cabinet members, kept him isolated as much as possible and helped carry out all the essential business of the efforts of being president. So Wilson failed miserably on the world stage. And as I said when we started discussing him, of all the American presidents I feel most sorry for, President Wilson is the one. Okay? But France and Britain were too exhausted to keep Germany isolated, and as a result, a power vacuum develops in Europe. And there's an old adage in science, nature abhors vacuum. And so nature abhorred the vacuum that was existing. And during the 1920s, especially the 1930s, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement will flow into that vacuum. We'll talk about that a little more as we get to the future. Okay, beginning in 1918, if World War I had not been enough, Americans, along with Europeans, faced what was called the Spanish flu. Of course, we're operating under a little different circumstances because of a virus that is going around now. But in the initial outbreak that lasted about a year, some 20 to 50 million people died as a result of this Spanish influenza. Of course, realize in Europe, you have a lot of people that have been weakened and their immune systems damaged as a result of the war. And so it was only logical that a devastating plague like this would kill millions of people. Now, your textbook says no disease in human history has killed so many people. Probably second to this would have been the Black Death in the Middle Ages. Coming back home, some things began to happen. Number one, women get the vote. They had come out, they had supported the war effort. Many women had worked in the war industry, and as a result of this, they are rewarded with the vote. By the way, it will be the 22nd nation to allow women to vote. So we're definitely not on the cutting edge or the leadership of such an activity as that. As we come out of the war, consumer prices continue to rise. Obviously, they did during the war, but it doesn't stop. You have disgruntled workers released from controls on their wages, but they were more willing to go out on strike after the war to have their demands met. So there are going to be quite a few labor disputes that will take place. In the summer of 1919, we're going to have a wave of deadly race riots across the nation. Now, remember, I've been telling you over and over and over again that all racial discrimination was not located in the South. And 1919 is a year that very much proves that. In fact, that year alone, about 25 race riots erupted. Black leaders were disappointed in any positive results that came from the war. And not only that, but in 1919, because of what has taken place in Russia, now the Soviet Union, there are fears of a revolution in America, and what will be called the first Red Scare represented one of the largest violations of American civil liberties in history. Fear will control the country to the point that federal agents will be raiding separatist-type organizations. More than 5,000 people will be arrested, and Hoover compiled files on those who were suspects. So the FBI begins to keep records upon individual Americans themselves. By 1920, the scare is going to begin to subside some, but there was a terror of foreign terrorists, and vigilantes quite often would take matters into their own hands, and in many occasions, the local police and others just simply looked away as these took place. Okay, so what are the effects of this Great War? Number one, old Europe is gone. It just no longer exists. Number two, peace will not bring stability. The bitterness of the war lingers long after the shooting stopped, kind of like the American Civil War. Number three, the war, it hastened the Bolshevik Revolution, and now we have the Soviet Union, which is going to become another threat in and of itself. But then we look at America. Number one, for the first time, the United States had decisively intervened in a European war. Number two, the American economy had emerged largely unscathed. And then number three, the United States was now the world's dominant power. So World War I changed everything. We have a whole new world in existence as a result of what took place. The U.S., Europe, so much of the world is a completely different place now. And so that brings us to the 1920s, and your textbook calls this a clash of cultures. Many times this period is known as the Roaring Twenties. And basically, in the U.S., it was one of the most dynamic decades in history. It was contradictory, it was conflict-ridden. You had rapid urbanization, you had technological innovation, you had widespread prosperity, unparalleled social freedom, cultural upheaval, and then political conservatism. If it, pardon my French, ain't broke, don't fix it. And so you have the U.S. basically wanting to rebel against 19th century morality while Europe goes into depression. Now, this is not to say there was not some of the things going on in the U.S. going on in Europe, but definitely not to the way it was here in this country. Okay, the economic boom is based on a lot of new technologies. Automobiles, trucks, tractors, airplanes. We're going to use them for delivering the mail. We're going to start carrying passengers on airplanes. Radios, movies, electrical appliances, indoor plumbing. All of these things are going to reshape and improve the standard of living in the United States. The radio and the movies are going to spread mass culture. Baseball is going to become the national pastime. You're going to have baseball teams everywhere. Okay, as women are allowed to vote, We have also their efforts at attacking alcohol and other things coming to fruition in the 18th Amendment that outlawed alcoholic beverages. And of course, all that did was create an epidemic of law breaking. People would make what they call bathtub gin. You had bootleggers. You had bootleggers versing the law. You had law officials being bribed. You had violent gang wars breaking out in the big cities. You had merchants being forced to pay for protection. And public officials basically took bribes and looked the other way. And a lot of the cultural conflict that is going to grow in the 20s is going to come out of a tension between rural and urban ways of life. Urban Americans generally prospered. Sadly, farmers are going to suffer from the end of the wartime boom. And this is going to be our first point we make in building toward the Great Depression, because this is where the Depression is going to begin. Anything they could grow, they could sell. But now all of that has changed. Now, during the 20s, it is true the United States is going to become the economic envy of the world. Americans are going to benefit from a fast economic growth rate. And quite honestly, that is going to turn around and contribute to the coming depression. Jobs were plentiful, inflation was low, and income rose throughout the decade. Construction was the thing that led the way. We have a building boom that would last throughout the entire decade of the 20s. And the automotive industry created a need for roads, highways, bridges, other things. And so steel, concrete, furniture, all of these things are going to be very, very important. And one thing I want you to realize about America's, shall I call it a love affair with the automobile, is the fact that it spelled freedom. Such an important concept and idea in American thought. And so the car was freedom, and that's what people wanted. Okay, perhaps the most visible change was a consumer culture. Mass production, mass consumption, nationally advertised products. I know all of you love commercials. You're watching something on television, something is about to happen in what you're watching, and all of a sudden, we're interrupted with commercials. Well, that has been a part of America for a long, long time. And a lot of these national advertised products are going to become debated as a part of social life and social status. The U.S. enters a new era in which consumption of goods became a national exception. And with this obsession comes the idea that we have buying on credit. A lot of Americans during the 1920s are going to get themselves in a tremendous amount of debt. Credit flows freely. They buy freely, and of course, that gets them in a lot of trouble. So during the 20s, old virtues of hard work, plain living, frugal money management are challenged by celebrating leisure, self-expression, and self-indulgence. And these all came through the purchase of, quote, name brand products. In fact, Coca-Cola, not the American flag, not the eagle, Coca-Cola will become the symbol of U.S. life. And that's an important point to remember. To keep people buying, business executives will focus their attention on marketing and advertising campaigns and the idea of layaway, in other words, buying on credit. If you don't have enough cash to pay up front, you make installment payments. And consumer debt is going to triple during the 1920s. This will help bring on the Depression because it just totally gets out of hand. On the radio, we have weekly programs, often sponsored by these national companies. And individuals who do these programs, now we're talking Paladin and things of this nature, people will come on and they will talk you through a scenario, even though you can't see it like you can on TV. They'll have dialogue and they'll try to paint a picture for you. And folks are going to be glued to the radio, and this is going to create a celebrity culture. Of course, we still have that today. There's going to be a huge jump in the use of electricity during the 20s. You're going to have more houses with indoor plumbing, washing machines, and more people are going to own automobiles. In fact, America will have a flood of automobile manufacturers. Basically, we only have 3 major automobile manufacturers in the U.S. today. But at one time, there were more than 25. All kinds of automobiles being produced. And some of them were quite amazing. Some of them quite amazing indeed. Okay, we have a marketplace of retail stores and store brands and regional businesses being squeezed out by these giant chain corporations, mass advertising and marketing campaigns. Mail will come and ask you to buy something or tell you need this. And so a lot of things that we take for granted today actually were kind of new in the 1920s. Americans are on the move. Boy, that automobile enables people to travel. They find new values, new viewpoints. As I say, it expanded other industries. Cars and trucks actually will hurt the railroads. And more Americans will move to the suburbs. And in doing so, they will be able to commute to their jobs in the city. One thing about the suburbs, and let's keep this in mind, at that time, suburbs were considered to be lily white. Now, what I mean by that phrase is that the African Americans were not moving out of the middle of the cities into suburbs. They were trapped in the inner city. It would be the more affluent whites that are fleeing the cities. And of course, them moving, taking their resources and their money with them is going to hurt in the future development of the cities. Your book says Americans spent 10 times as much on movies as they did on tickets to baseball and football games. And movies literally will spread the American way of life. Radio broadcasting, we've already mentioned. So after dinner, and families usually ate dinner together, after dinner, the family would gather around the radio and they'd listen to music and speeches and news broadcasts and weather forecasts and comedy shows. 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright will build and fly the first airplane at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And of course, we've already mentioned how in something like 11 years, that feeble attempt at flight will create a war machine that will become very effective in World War I. The Air Commerce Act of 1926 will provide for the advancement of air transportation and navigation, including the construction of airports. And in 1927, the aviation industry will receive a big boost when a 26-year-old Charles Lindbergh made the first solo transatlantic flight. He traveled from New York to Paris in 33 and a half hours. The car culture is going to be revolutionary. Ford Motor Company will be established in 1903. And of course, with the use of the assembly line, Henry Ford is basically going to transform business all the way around. Vast oil wells in Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and California will spur the car industry, and it will be the leading example of modern mass production and efficiency. U.S. companies will produce about 85% of the world's cars and about 40% of all the world's manufactured goods. During the 20s, the United States built 10 times more automobiles than all of Europe. So that'll give you an idea how it is growing in America and how many people are involved. So we can live further from our workplaces, we can get out of the urban sprawl, and we can enjoy spectator sports. Baseball in the 1920s had gone urban. It earned its label of national pastime. Workers was viewed only as a path to individual fulfillment. Now that's a big change. Used to be Americans were proud of what they produce, the quality of the product. Some of the old furniture that we find in the U.S. today, you'll find where the craftspeople actually signed their names inside of it. Well, as people begin to go to a leisure society, work is only a means of providing for that. But as we think about the national pastime, baseball is very much segregated. You have white baseball leagues, you have black baseball leagues. And during the 20s, football really begins to take off, especially in American colleges. And it is going to become a way of showing support for your favorite school. All right. As we think about all of these things, a new type of music begins to emerge. Now, if you recall, we talked about the music that developed in African American worship when they were still on the plantations and so on. Well, as a part of this, jazz, which is a dynamic blend of several traditions, will begin to emerge, and African American performers will actually become popular even among white audiences. And so one of those areas that we're going to begin to crack the racial boundary is going to be in music, although that does not make everyone happy. You will have large dance halls built, and jazz music and the dance craze will accompany it. And there are going to be some fairly wild dances that will come into being during the 1920s as well. So the Jazz Age provides a big shock, and it also creates a revolution in manners and morals among young people. The women's liberation movement that we've already talked about, it gains a lot of fuel during the 20s. It grows greatly during the 20s. We're throwing away Elizabethan morality, and we begin to talk about things publicly that, quite honestly, had been talked about only behind closed doors. Psychoanalysis becomes a celebrated as well as controversial technique for helping troubled people come to grip with their various demons with which they are dealing in their lives. And a lot of new fashions in clothing reveal the women's rebellion against traditional roles. Women are going to start wearing pants. They're going to start showing their ankles. They're going to deliberately become outrageous and outlandish as they want more than just marriage and motherhood. They will have a carefree vision of feminism that will be fun-loving, defiant, and at the same time self-indulgent. But this is only before women are married. Once they get a husband, they were expected to basically withdraw back into the homes. Most of the women in the 20s were young, college-educated women, and they were not the flappers, as they were called. They were not the ones out there rebelling against everything. So you have a conservative mood that kept some women back to traditional roles, and college curricula actually reflected some of that. You would have women's schools, you would have home economic courses and things of this nature. And so during the 20s, with all this going on, with all the changes that are taking place, you have still a majority of women being full-time housewives and mothers or household servants. All right. In their great migration from the South, a lot of African Americans are going to find some new freedoms of speech and expression in the North. And when they do, there's going to come to be a protest of sorts known as the Harlem Renaissance. And this is literally going to be the nation's first self-conscious black literary and artistic movement. And Harlem, remember, going all the way back to the Dutch, is going to become the capital, so-called, of black America. There are going to be African Americans come along and celebrate their heritage as well as their contributions to American culture with the idea of jazz and blues and other things. There also comes to be an idea of promoting black separatism. It's called Garveyism, named after an individual who led it. He insisted that blacks had nothing in common with whites, and he wanted racial separation to exist between the two groups. And he actually wanted to build an all-black nation in Africa that was made up of individuals who had left the United States and gone to form this new nation. Didn't really pan out the way he dreamed, but anyway, it was something that was beginning to work under the currents in the United States, and some of this will come back out again during the Civil Rights Movement. Another organization will begin to emerge, and it will be called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. It is going to be the idea that the solution to the social problems that exist in the United States are going to come about as a result of education. And they are going to emphasize education, education, education. This is going to be a very, very important aspect. So politically, and this is going to be the first step in the American Civil Rights Movement. Politically, these individuals are going to be focusing on the idea of legal action to make sure that the 14th and 15th Amendments are brought back to life, and that Americans get a chance to be able to improve their rights and privileges as a result of these court actions. And they're actually going to develop quite a few very, very important jurists who will help them along the way.